Hello everybody! I saw this fun little video from Leena Norms, who I love, and if you haven't heard of her, you should totally check her out. She was discussing the New York Times best books of the 21st. What century are we in? Leena Norms was commenting on the New York Times best books of the 21st century, and I thought that was fun, so I thought I could do a little video in a similar vein where I comment on the books they chose. And then I do what Leena did, which is pick what I consider to be the best book per year of the 21st century of the ones I've read. Finally ending with just a few books I think should totally be on the list but are not. I have my notes on my computer, so if you see me looking at not you, that is why. Because I have a lot of thoughts. Surprise. According to the article, these books, the 100 books, were voted in by 503 novelists, nonfiction writers, poets, critics, book lovers, and some help from the staff at the New York Times. It was crazy how many books I did not know on this list. Like, that's notable because not only am I a lifelong reader who reads a variety of different topics, I also went to school for creative writing and English literature, and I worked for 2 years at a bookstore. So I don't know if they're the best if no one knows of them. Is that a hot topic? Is that a interesting stance? Because like, again, like, I think when you're talking about the best of a century, I think it boils down, in my opinion, to two things. One, which is the quality of the writing, of the content, of the meaningful themes that point at, highlight, grapple with issues of that time period that are resonant to the human experience. And then the second thing being impact, which is like, if only 3 people have read it, has it really had an impact? Now, this doesn't mean that all the books have to be mainstream. It doesn't mean that everyone and their mom has to read it. Oftentimes that's not the case. But I do think that while some books can have kind of a renaissance later on in their life as a book or a story, I think it oftentimes they resonate in the now, the now that they were published in. But well, let's continue on. There was 2 books that were on the list that I highly agree with, which is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, prophet extraordinaire. It's a like dystopian literary story about a virus that wipes out a huge chunk of humanity on a global scale a couple years before the pandemic. So pertinent in every way. And then Pachinko by Min Jin Lee, which is a really interesting Korean-Japanese generational saga. Wildly, there was 3 books on this list by the same author, from Elena Ferrante, which you might have heard of that author's name from My Brilliant Friend, which now has an adaptation, I believe. And so I wasn't surprised to see My Brilliant Friend on the list. I was surprised to see 2 other books of hers that I hadn't heard of, and also I don't know that many people who've read her in general, but anyway, who am I to say? I was also crazy surprised to see Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. It is a really popular book of the moment. It is a really new book, and not to say that like a new book can't make a big splash and they couldn't, you know, predict its value, but nothing I've heard about it suggests that it's like a literary anchor of this time, or that it's like the best book ever. I've heard good reviews, I've heard mixed reviews. I don't know. I didn't think it was going to fall in this kind of category, but again, I haven't read it. And then there were some that were kind of obvious, not very surprising. You had Cloud Atlas, Atonement, The Road, Americana. I DNF'd Cloud Atlas, but I can see why it's on the list. I can see the value and merit of it. I haven't read Atonement and I haven't read Americana, but they are solid fixtures of the literary scene, so it makes sense. And The Road is fucking devastating. And I think definitely has a place on this list. One thing I do love about the article itself, and why I highly recommend you check it out, it kind of has this nifty thing where there's boxes you can check on if you've read the book versus if you want to read the book, which is fun. So you don't have to keep track of yourself. It'll give you a total at the end. And if you have read the book and enjoyed it, they do, in like smaller print, give you 1 to 2 other books that you might like, and I think that's fun. On to best books by year. So this is what Leena Norms did in her video. I will definitely link it down below. I thought this was a fun little nifty idea. I don't normally pick up books and look at or care about when they were published or anything like that. I tend to be behind the times because I hate hardcovers, but other than that, I just pick up what I'm interested in. Now, this was interesting because it's by year. And so sometimes I had a hard time picking because there was a lot of good books that I read that I loved that were published in the same year. And some years there was a dearth. And that's not necessarily a dearth in the world, just a dearth in what I have read. I can't vote for a thing I haven't read in my made up rules for this video. I was also picking based off of the notion again of what I was mentioning earlier. It wasn't just books I enjoyed, it was books that I think have real merit and also impact. So let's get into it. 2000. I picked Kitchen Confidential by Anthony Bourdain. I think this is a really solid read. I think it's really fascinating. It's kind of a milestone in both, I think, cultural interest in culinary endeavors, and it was just on the brink of starting Anthony Bourdain's career in the food travel space, and that kind of launched an entire fleet of similar shows. And I think that has not only intellectually change how people think and look at food and the industry itself, but also just, yeah, it drove this new passion and interest in multiple avenues. 2001. Didn't have a great pick for this one, but I ended up with Life of Pi by Yann Martel. I think this is a good book, an interesting book, and I think it brought a lot of readers into the idea of a unreliable narrator and a story, and especially ending that's kind of infused with ambiguity. So I think it hit some pressure points there on that. 2002, The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. The New York Times best books list didn't really include a whole lot of self-help. I think for especially pillar books like The Artist's Way, that it's just helped tens of thousands of people. It's referenced all the time in other self-help and writing works. And it's this interesting blend that you're seeing more and more now of the fuse of spiritualism and Zen with different topics. So in this case, it's writing. 2003, I put The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon. This was a really popular book back in the day. The voice is stellar. It is so good, and it's so good in a very unique sense because not only is it a very memorable embodiment of a character and a perspective and lens of the world, but I really like the fact that in the lens, you totally agree with the character, even when they're wrong, and if you pulled out of the book and zoomed out, you're yeah, that A plus B doesn't equal C. But in their head, it's of course A plus B equals C. Naturally, which is really fascinating. And then you also have it to where it's never directly stated, but this kid's clearly on the spectrum. And so you're also getting this grappling of a child's point of view plus neurodivergency, which is, I think, only starting to get traction at this point in time in the early 2000s. So that's kind of cool to see it hit such a mainstream audience. 2004, Crank by Ellen Hopkins. This one, if you haven't read anything by Ellen Hopkins, she has a really interesting poetic style. She plays around with a very experimental form and structure to her books, which is really cool and nifty and so exciting to see on the young adult scale. From what I remember her saying in an interview, she writes the book full out. And then she breaks it down into the structure. And so, sometimes if a certain scene takes place at Christmas, she might have the narrative or the dialogue of a page, the words make to look like a Christmas tree. Or there's a lot of bouncing back and forth. And so you can read it straight across or you could read it straight down. So hard to explain without visual representation, but it's so cool and nifty. Highly recommend. 2005, I picked Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. I didn't have a lot of books to choose from 2005, so I wouldn't necessarily say Blink is the best or the pinnacle of Malcolm Gladwell's books, but I think all of his books have good merit to them, and it is a really interesting nonfiction read. In the best books that the New York Times gave, they had some nonfiction, but not as much in the personal development, sociological, psychological space from what I remember. So I thought this was a good one to point out. 2006, Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth Gilbert. Here you have this deeply personal memoir that just hit the hearts of so many people. It's kind of become an overhyped, really cliche book and sentiment in modern day, but that also could not have happened if it hadn't had the range and impact that it did. You have a woman grappling with modern day life and responsibilities, and it's like, what is the value I'm going to place on my happiness? How do I find happiness? What happens when the things I've been told will make me happy and successful aren't doing it for me? Her traveling solo, her falling into the world of meditation, things like that, I think grounded a lot of these elements and this cultural and gendered discontentment that it was developing at that time, and I think still goes on today. Just beautiful writing, very heartfelt, very raw, very vulnerable. I still recommend it, even though it's overhyped. So go in with the right expectations, but I think it's really good. 2007. I have The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. I think it's really interesting in the fantasy space. I don't think it's reached as large of an audience as some of the other books I've pointed out, just because with it being like a really fat fantasy book, that's immediately going to turn some readers off. But I think he's doing some really interesting stuff for the genre. He, again, has a very poetic language and interesting perspective and view set on, you know, the chosen one narrative and heroes and things like that, and the narrative style and the frame, which for those of you who don't know, it's about this guy named Quoth, I believe that's his name. I've never really said it out loud, so hopefully I won't be yelled at. It's like present day, he's a much older dude. He is like an innkeeper. Stuff happens to where he has to tell this dude his story, and then the bulk of it is his story from when he was a young kid to when he became this crazy badass wizard dude. So very interesting read, and I think it holds its place in the genre fantasy canon. 2008, Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. I don't know where this fits in as far as literary, I don't know. It's always tricky with these categories because they're a bit gray and subjective, and some people get a little too uptight about them. But the impact is clearly there. I think it started so much conversation about capitalism, consumerism, how we view war and privilege, and all these really important topics and themes. I've reread it as an adult, and it's just stellar writing. The pacing's amazing. The characterization, the games, everything super on par. It's one of those things that really not only works in the young adult genre, but isn't limited to that age group. 2009, 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami. This is such a weird book. I always have a hard time explaining it because I don't love it, but it's just so entrancing. It's a very hypnotic, dreamlike, surreal read. I think Murakami in general is at the forefront of that kind of literature. I think that's doing something very interesting, and I think I'm not smart enough to understand all the themes of 1Q84, but it's got a lot of stuff. Like, it goes deep, so I think it makes sense to be on the list. 2010, I have The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot, but really fascinating blend of science and African American studies, sociology kind of thing. And I was surprised it wasn't on the list. My girl Oprah adopted it. Come on, New York Times. But really fascinating. It's about this Black woman back in the day. I can't remember what trouble she was having with her health, but she was going in and out of different doctors. And unfortunately, we have a long history in this country, being America, of doing things in the medical field without Black people's consent or knowledge. So they like totally took this woman's cells and were able to do extraordinary things with it, and never gave her credit, never paid royalties to her or her family. And so I think it's just a really important read, and it combines so many important things about what we're grappling with today when it comes to race and gender and science and morality and ethics and advancements in human life and wellness, and it's got so much. So really good read. 2011, The Martian by Andy Weir. I think this did such a number for hard science fiction. Such a thrilling read, very gripping. I think it really rejuvenized that subgenre, because I think a lot of people found it very inaccessible, because a lot of us are not, you know, sciencey nerds. We don't like, it's like magic to us. We're like, I don't know, don't ask me how my phone works, it just does. And it really combined that, the pacing and emotional investment and humor needed, and the clarity of these scientific principles and thought processes without dumbing it down for the reader that I think is just stellar. 2012. I actually had several I could have chosen from for this year, so it was a little bit hard for me to pick one. I ended up going with Wild by Cheryl Strayed. This is part of this cultural movement of women really reimagining their lives and getting outside, reconnecting with nature, doing things solo, walking, hiking. So many people started walking the PCT and other trails after this book. Cheryl's just so wise. I love her writing. I love her insight. And yeah, it needs to be on the list. 2013, I have Complications by Atul Gawande. He has written so much good shit. I don't know Complications would be the one I would choose necessarily, but it's the one I had for 2013, so here we are. He is a best-selling author and a surgeon, which is totally unfair that he is good at so many things. Such accessible writing and pointing out such important issues such as perfectionism in the medical industry or lack of knowledge, communication. There's so much fascinating. So you get the behind the scenes look from a dude who really knows, but also it's universal. It's human nature of like, you don't want to admit that you're wrong. You don't want to let other smart people in the room think you're dumb. And I think, yeah, there's just so many applications for his writing and the topics he discusses. 2014, I also had several books I had to choose from, but I picked Bad Feminist by Roxane Gay. I feel like it was a very formative book for the upcoming wave of feminism, pushing away from the like sterile, perfectionistic white feminism and really getting gritty about the reality that we're imperfect beings. Like we might have these stances and these thoughts about a better world and gender equality and X, Y, and Z, but it doesn't mean we're always fulfilling that in every aspect of our lives. Sometimes we listen to music that's problematic, etc., etc. You know, so I think this is a really pivotal nonfiction read. Okay. Going fast so I don't bore you. Let's go. 2015 was a hard year for me. I didn't read a lot of books published in 2015, surprisingly. I was in college, so that might have been part of it. So I picked Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. I had no idea it was published that long ago. That's wild. But I think it is one of the many books that have kind of emphasized this renaissance in Japanese literature in a global capacity. Interesting book, Time Travel Cafe. It sinks into these really deep topics about health, memory, regret, grief, and in such a tiny book it touches on a lot of different themes and topics of, I think, the modern age. 2016, Homegoing by Yagiyazi. So good. This is a really interesting, I guess, generational saga, but the idea is you have these two women who are in Africa and one sister gets married and ends up staying in Africa, and the other sister ends up being sold into slavery into the States. And you follow that lineage of their children and children's children. But each chapter almost feels like a short story because you really get into the mindset and the world of that person. And yet it is created more fulfilling and fuller because you have this larger familial thread that's connecting their experiences with the past and the present. So good. I think it's such a fascinating overview is the wrong term because again it gets really deep and personal in each moment in time and for each character, each family member, but it gives a new angle to the conversation of history and the African diaspora and what it means to be African, what it means to be American, what it means to be African American, how to navigate this reality that we're in that's come from such grief and trauma. And yeah, really good. I'm due for a reread soon. 2017, I have Pachinko by Minjin Lee. It's already on the New York Times best books list, so I won't go into it too much. I agree. 2018, I have Dare to Lead by Brené Brown. I feel like Brené Brown's literature in general has been really instrumental to creating a more mindful intention for everyone. But in this book, it's for leaders and maybe people who don't consider themselves a leader or don't want to lead, but have the qualities for it or are thrust into a position where they need to. and really reimagining what that looks like, what the power dynamics look like, what that means for you as the individual, and this really holistic perspective that's backed up by science and sociology and stuff like that. Really valuable. And we live in a world where like self-help and personal development are so big right now that it seems weird that there seem to be like a dearth of that on the New York Times list. 2019, We Are the Weather by Jonathan Safran Foer. So crucial for eco change, climate change, environmental literature. It's such, it imbues the humanity in this dilemma that we're facing and really tackles the psychological and sociological and cultural reasons why it's so hard to grapple with the idea that this is happening and that this disaster, this catastrophe is coming up soon on the horizon, and why it's even harder to do anything about it or make the right choices regarding it. And it's like also part memoir. It's just a beautiful literary journey. Knocks it out of the park in several different categories, and the blend of which is so unique. I've never seen it before in environmental literature, and I think it's so crucial because it's like, what's missing? We have plenty of books, plenty of articles, plenty of documentaries on the science and X, Y, and Z and what we should do and what we shouldn't do, and yet here we are where most people are not doing it. So I think this is a really vital must read. 2020, Untamed by Glennon Doyle. Love this book, changed my life. So good. This is a very intimate, vulnerable memoir, grappling with what it means to be a woman, dealing with being a mother, dealing with her sexuality, dealing with a marriage that's falling apart and all that. I think these intimate looks into other people's lives, especially from marginalized groups, is really prevalent during this time and so vital and such a part of the DNA of the 21st century. We're talking about things that we've never really talked about before to this degree and in this depth and in this honesty, and claiming it. Because I think back in the day, more often than not, these kinds of topics would be covered in like autofiction. Like people would like slap a few details around and then be like, it's fiction. So for someone to claim it, it's not fiction, I think is kind of revolutionary of this century. 2021, The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. Love, love, love. I love John Green's heart. It's kind of a secret memoir, I feel like, because it's a series of essays about the human condition and the quirky, weird, amazing things of life, from NASCAR to this extinct bird to Mario Kart to Dr. Pepper. But infused within it is his personal experience and memories and emotion and why things matter. And it's such a hopeful, heartfelt read. 2022, I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. So this is a behind the scenes, a really honest, poignant account of someone who became a child star. And also so many hard to imagine topics of eating disorders and mental health and familial dysfunction and OCD and just and again, I think to see it on the level of a celebrity talking about this, and more than just airing out dirty laundry, but to really grapple with it, to really reconcile and do the work to craft something that's not just like a vomiting of trauma dumpingness, but to turn it into art, I think is so good, so vital, such a memoir that I think is going to keep having ripple effects. 2023, 8 Rules of Love by Jay Shetty. This is a really good book. I'm out of touch in a lot of ways, so I don't know how much this book has impacted. I know it probably sold really well and a lot of people read it because it's Jay Shetty, who's the online figure, but I thought it was really good to include a book that I feel like is such a holistic perspective on relationships, romantic relationships, sure, but relationships in general as well. And I think a lot of this century is not taking anything for granted and realizing traditions aren't always good, and like, how do we repair? How do we not only heal ourselves, but the connections we have with other people? We're almost done. I have just 6 books I want to mention as best book picks that didn't fit into the little by year category thing. Inciting Joy, Essays by Ross Gay. Fuck, this is good. It's so good. I didn't know much going in. He is a poet, he is an essayist, and you can just see that. Like, there's footnotes, there's parentheses, there's dashes, there's these like almost run-on sentences, but there's such, it just takes you on this beautiful journey through his mindset, through these different factors of ecology, of community, of history, of being a man, being a Black man, finding joy, dealing with grief, reimagining our lives. Ah, so good. I don't have the words for it. You just gotta read it. Number 2, New Poets of Native Nations, edited by Heidi Idrick. Gorgeous poetry, excellent poetry. And what a blend of different styles and structures. Also just in one foul swoop, reminding the whole genre that like, hey, poetry is more than just 10 white dudes. I love it. It's really good. And I think more people should read it. And then the book that I think is most potent for everyone is Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. Oof, I read it at just the right time, but like grappling with like how we age, how we want to age, how we experience our loved ones aging, the hard conversations we need to have that we oftentimes don't, the quality life that we have or don't have with our elderly people, and when the conversations about death and dying, must read for everyone. It's something that's going to come up time and time again in everyone's lives, and we always are not prepared for it, even though it's the one thing that's going to happen that you can guarantee on. Habit of a Foreign Sky by, I don't know how to pronounce the name, so I'm not gonna even try. I'll just put it here. It's such a good book. I feel like I keep repeating myself, but such a good book. It was a very interesting read at this idea of grief, being a woman in her either late 30s, early 40s, but having this global life, this global career. She travels for work and she's bilingual, and what do you want out of the second half of your life? And what matters when your immediate loved ones die, and reconnecting with people you knew in your past or that you had a kind of tenuous relationship with, or learning more about your loved ones after they die. So many vital topics, very interesting. Seek You, A Journey Through American Loneliness by Kristen Radke. I'm gonna reread this in the next couple weeks because I keep thinking about it. Loneliness in general, isolation, has been a thing that's been creeping up more and more in the modern life, but it's reached new highs with the pandemic. It's such an interesting journey into the psychology of that, and I think it's just, oh, it spoke and like pointed a finger right at what a lot of us are dealing with and experiencing, and sometimes the contradictory nature of human beings, where it's like, why is it that I'm lonely, but I don't want to go out and see people? This just grounds it and hits it home in such a resonant way that I'm still like having it sink in, and I want to read it again, and I want to take notes this time. And then last we have Ballistics by Billy Collins. This is another poetry collection. I want more people to read him that like don't normally read poetry, because his work is so accessible. It feels simple but has layers, and what I mean by that is that you can do just a once-off reading as like a casual non-poetry person and be like, oh, I get it. Oh, that's interesting. And then like, if you wanted to do the work, there is more there, but you can just have the initial enjoyment, which I think is nice. And it's this beautiful contemplation of the like the mundane things in life, but imbued with like such a fun and slightly like mischievous humor. Like he has a poem about cats not behaving or just food he liked. And you know, so like it's grounded in these everyday experiences we can all relate to, but then he elevates it or takes it to another thoughtful level for you to think about. Okay, enough talking. That's my thoughts, that's my list. I hope you enjoyed this. I had so much fun perusing through my read books to decide what to share and which ones to pitch. Let me know down below, what books do you think should be in the best books of the 21st century? And like and subscribe for more content. See you next time.